Hi, so yes, I am Callum Abbott, also known as AB Psychology on Discord. I provide sport and exercise psychology support to Team Endpoint, and I also work in traditional sports as well and some other esports. I actually got into sports psychology after doing my undergraduate degree. I used to play a fair bit of sport whilst at university, and I was studying psychology at the time. I originally thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist, so obviously going to help with mental illness and things, but then started playing sport and I was fascinated by, you're in the locker room, you're going out to a match, and the amount of different routines that people had, the different things people would do to kind of get in the zone or make sure they were ready to go and play. And that was kind of the first really steps into sports psychology I had. I actually did my dissertation piece into kind of aggression in sport, which kind of led me down the path of really fascinating research avenues and actual practical work within sport and the kind of psychology behind that. And then after that, I decided to pursue it further, went and did my master's degree at Loughborough University, and then on to further education as well, which you need to become a qualified sport and exercise psychologist in the UK. So yeah, that's kind of generally my route to this job. It's a really good question. I think sports psychology is so important and almost sometimes essential in this industry, because it's, if we take traditional sport, right, there's a fair balance between the physical aspects and then the mental aspects as well. Obviously the mental side of traditional sport is so important. But with esports, there's, I would say a much higher threshold of kind of mental challenge, we'll say. There's a lot more perhaps in terms of using the mind and mentality than there is perhaps of the physicality side of things. So we'll be sitting at desks often for upwards of 10 hours a day sometimes. I see a lot of players do that, really exercising their mind. There'll often be a lot of mental fatigue, perhaps sometimes people approaching burnout, but compare that to a traditional sport. If you tried to do 10 hours of traditional sport, you'd probably collapse. If you were playing football for 10 hours, your body physically couldn't take that. Whereas in esports, fascinatingly, the body can kind of take that because it's a lot more smaller movements, micro movements and so on. Yeah, I think there's a real need for support in esports because of that. There's not necessarily as much support currently in esports as there is in traditional sport for the athletes, for the players, and even for the staff as well that work within these organisations. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between traditional sports and esports with sports psychology. I think you've still got the elements of competition, very competitive people often, getting into these disciplines. You've got the team aspect as well. Communication is so important. You've got to learn to handle pressure, I think, which is essential at any high level of sport, whether you're playing darts, snooker, rugby, or even playing Rocket League. There is really no difference in terms of that pressure that you will feel. But I think one of the most fascinating differences, at least that I've found within sport and esports, is perhaps the environments that people compete in. So the fascinating thing about esports is you can compete at home. You can feel comfortable at home, or you can compete at a boot camp or a local facility, maybe even an internet cafe, depending on where you're from. But when it comes to actual competition times and those big LAN events, it's a huge change in environment. You're going to a stadium where you might never have been there before, and I think helping to perhaps prepare players for that is such an important part of esports, but such a nice kind of unique part of esports in that people can play where they're comfortable. They can play at home, or they can actually have to go in front of thousands of people and play on stage, or even online as well. We've got things like Twitch or YouTube streaming services where people will have to play knowing that they're being watched by tens of thousands or even sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, which comes with its own added layer of pressure as well. That's a tough one. What's the biggest factor to focus on with pro players? I think first off, it's different for everyone. Every pro I've worked with is different, especially with different games. Different games have their own kind of subcultures of ways of training and what they'd like to do. But I think for me, one thing that has kind of spanned all the games I've worked in, we're talking from Siege to League of Legends to Rocket League to CS, is kind of finding that balance. And that's that balance between training hard, training properly, and competing, but also of really enjoyment in other aspects of your life as well. So kind of maintaining that healthy kind of lifestyle balance, perhaps even some exercise in there as well, alongside the high level of performance that's expected of you as a professional. So for me, one of the core things I focus on is, of course, performance. That's really important, but it's also well-being. I tend to kind of straddle this line between, we really want you to perform as best you can, but not at the expense of how you feel and your well-being. So that's quite an important part of my work, at least, is working on those two sides in tandem. Yeah, I think that's really important as well. I think personally, I always like to say to people I work with that I don't have the silver bullet. There's no magic option. It's not going to necessarily fix any issues you might come to me with, but there's a lot we can do to kind of lay the foundations for, hopefully, along the line, kind of helping out. Now, absolutely, there are some more perhaps short-term things we can do, things that we'd probably call mental skills training, which are things like breathing exercises, perhaps visualization, imagery work, things that can help in that moment. Perhaps someone's a bit nervous before a match. There's a few things you can say, a few things you can do, which can have quite an instant impact sometimes, depending on how receptive the person is to that. But I think in the long term, there's a lot more work that takes time, but can be really rewarding, because that work that takes time can often stay with the player for a long time. But I do say it does take effort as well from the player. It's not like me just handing you a tool and saying go and use that and lo and behold you're fixed. It takes a lot of work from both sides. So obviously me working with the player and the player working through that as well, because just like we'd perhaps say, if you're a coach, you've got to go and practice this stuff. Let's say in Rocket League, if you wanted to learn how to flip reset, you would have to, probably sit in a training pack for many hours practicing that, working with your coach, learning what's going wrong, what you'd like to do more, kind of developing that skill. I like to say the kind of same thing for sports psychology. If we're trying to learn a skill, if we're learning a different way of thinking or perspective taking, it's going to take time where you need to practice that in your own time, and also with me, we'll check it and we'll try and tally those two up and hopefully get you performing as best. Kind of like the gym as well. You're not going to build loads of muscle if you only practice it once, or if someone's told you, oh, you have to do the bench press, this is how you do it. If you only do it once, it's not really going to do much. You have to really work at it and keep working at it to see a difference. Brilliant question. I think personally for me, what motivated me really was, I think it was during my masters actually, with esports specifically. I was seeing how much support traditional sports got. So football teams have to have sports psychologists on board. Rugby teams would be bringing on sports psychologists, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, everything to help support their athletes. And then we'd look across to esports, which is booming and has a lot more kind of money in it nowadays than it ever has done in the past. But there is still that gap. There's less support for those players, less support for those individuals, which you would see perhaps in a traditional sports setting. So I was thinking, right, well, we need to get the word out there. I actually started by creating a blog years ago called Manna for the Mind, believe it or not, excuse the awful title. It was the best I could come up with all those years ago, kind of just talking about the importance of the mind and the mindset and kind of staying healthy as well when gaming, because I just saw that there was very little out there. Thankfully, that is changing massively now. You're getting teams that are bringing on board all of these things like strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, and sports psychologists and mental coaches as well on the side. So, yeah. It's a good question. I think one of my favourite go-tos for kind of helping aspiring players or current pro players to manage that pressure is just to remind them that you're doing the same job you've done for every single day of the past however many years you've played. I like to use the analogy of a sprinter. If you're a 100-metre sprinter and you're nervous before you've perhaps got to the Olympics, I would probably say to that person, well, it's still 100 metres you have to run. Whether that's at your local track or whether that's at the Olympics, it's the exact same job. So go through the steps that you do at home, bring them in to that other arena. Same for a pro as well, just before going out onto a LAN environment. All right, the PCs may be different, but your control is still the same. The game itself is exactly the same. Nothing has changed there except your perception of what's around you and what's at stake. So if we can remind you, actually, I'm just playing the game again. I do this every day of my life. I've done this so many times before, and sometimes that can help bring that pressure down just a little bit. Now, obviously, in the long term, it might not be amazing, but in those clutch moments where you're just about to go out, sometimes that can be the difference between a player feeling confident going into a game and perhaps being a bit shaky and not really taking the shots that they probably should be taking at that point. Yeah, it's a really key part. Obviously, a huge part of my job is kind of, I guess, helping people manage emotions and move through those emotions. I think emotions are an essential part of anyone's life, of course, but also performance. If we can bring good motivations and good emotions, I guess, to the fore, such as positivity, happiness and motivation, etc., then perhaps we can perform better sometimes. But if we've got perhaps some of the less productive, we'll call it emotions, such as anger, maybe we're tilting as well in a game, we've had a rough match, then that can have massive impact on not only your own communication, but also your teammates' communication. If they start to pick up on the fact that, maybe you're feeling frustrated or annoyed, they might start commenting a little bit less, they might start going for things less because maybe they're nervous that you're going to be angry at them if they do this or that. Emotions can really play such a huge part of of what we do, especially in esports, where so much of our kind of emotion is limited to what we do in game. People can't, if they're playing online, see you in person. They can't see how you're reacting, whether what you've said is, positive in emotion or negative in emotion, but they can only hear you, and they have to go off what they're hearing. So we have to be very careful, I think, with emotions in esports for sure, but they can be such a powerful tool. Posture check, yeah, one of my favourite things that me and Aaron do. You've probably seen it if you watch the Twitch streams, especially the guys at boot camp when they do play Rocket League. They'll be up and stretching in between matches. Sometimes they'll be standing up. My key thing around this, and we've talked about this extensively, me and Aaron, the coach, is kind of it just gives the players a moment to disengage. If they're just coming off a tough loss and we think it might be hard to reset, it's a good time to step away from the PC. Ground yourself a little bit, remind yourself where you are, have a stretch as well, take a breather and just kind of have a look around and be grateful as well. We work a lot on kind of gratefulness. Sometimes we take a step back and we say, how crazy is this? We're here, we're perhaps in another country competing, or we're at a boot camp playing video games for a living. And it helps kind of ground us in those moments where that pressure is really high and people think it's all or nothing. We remind themselves, actually, it's okay. You'll still be a pro tomorrow, no matter what happens today. And I think that's so important. But on the physical side, fascinating aspect of that stretching and that posture check work, is releasing tension. And when we're playing and things are getting stressful, we don't often notice, but our posture will start to go forward. Our necks will probably bend in, will become a little bit more tense. Our forearms will become quite tense. And you can imagine in a game where micro movements are so important, like Rocket League or CSGO, the tenser you are, the less smooth your movements are going to be. Because if you try tensing your arm really hard and moving a mouse, it's almost impossible. You're moving in jerky movements. And the more you've been playing the game, the more tense you're getting, the more jerky your movements might become. And in a big match, that may be just that half a centimetre to the left of a shot you should have hit as well. So if we can relax that, get that kind of fluid movement back again, kind of calm down perhaps by doing that stretching, taking a step back, disengaging, then we can kind of get back into the flow a little bit easier and remove that tension, hopefully. Not maybe remove it, but reduce it, sorry. Yeah, this is a huge debate currently in esports, but also in sports psychology as a whole. There is obviously two very convincing arguments of I have to play low, so I have to grind. Basically, I've got to grind 10, 12 hours a day, I've got to do this, but also the opposite side, which would kind of say, well, we don't have to grind 10 hours, let's perhaps just do maybe 4 to 6 hours with a specific goal in mind, with certain things in mind, so that we can improve. And yeah, obviously both sides have their merits, but I think personally from what I've seen in my experiences, I would highly recommend quality over quantity every time, because if we're pushing quantity every single day and you've got people training 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, maybe even sometimes 6 days a week, you tend to perhaps push people more towards burnout. A lack of motivation after time can become very stale if you're not mixing it up. Whereas on the other side of the coin, with quality, okay, you might not be playing 10 hours a day, but if you can make those 6 hours a day that you're playing what we call goal directed, so there's a reason for those 6 hours, then maybe we've actually got at least equal levels of improvement in those moments. Because let's say we had 10 hours a day where there wasn't really a goal other than maybe to try and rank up. It's like, okay, you're probably keeping your mechanics fresh, you're keeping other things fresh, but are you learning anything new, or are you just trying to rank up? Versus 6 hours a day where we could say, right, every single game I go into, I've got a goal. Maybe I need to work on my spray pattern control, or hit my flick shots better, or hit at least 2 flip resets in this game, or at least get 3 goals. We have a goal in mind for that, and there's potential for much more improvement than perhaps playing for even longer without a goal in mind. My favorite thing to ask is why? Why are you doing that today? Why? What are you working on? Where are you improving today? Which I think, and it's so simple, but I think it can really help with that quality of practice over perhaps the quantity and the hours and hours on end, which does have a lot of other issues that come alongside that as well. I'm so fascinated by esports and happy to see kind of the direction it's going in. I think obviously just coming back from LA with the boys and seeing the passion that people have for it, the community that esports has, I think there is so much potential for us to kind of go, I guess, in the right direction with esports. It's at that early stage where we could build in these frameworks where players have support through teams, they have strength and conditioning, they have sports psychology or even clinical psychology support if they need it, and those referral networks, where I think traditional sport, whilst it's so well established now, I think because we're at the start of perhaps an amazingly long kind of few decades with esports, we could really start strong, and we could learn everything we've learned from traditional sports and take those into our kind of future journey, I guess, very roundabout way of saying it, but you know what I mean. I'm just very excited to see where it goes, especially with having what we've learned from traditional sports. Let's use that and stand on the shoulders of giants, I guess.
Thank you very much, Callum.
Thank you.